everyone, welcome to the community classroom. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator. We are continuing our discussion related to the narrative in Africa related to some groups actually migrating from the east to the west coast of Africa. And when those groups indicate that they migrated from the east, they generally mean what is known as the Near East or the Middle East. And so we're going to look at some of that narrative. So this is a part of their historical narrative for their particular cultural groups. And so we're going to look at some commentary that came out of Nigaristan. And Nigaristan is a forum for individuals in Nigeria and Africa and basically anywhere, but there is a focus on issues related to the African continent and that history, the culture, political issues and dynamics. There are also conversations related to migrations out of the East going on in America, in the Americas. And so we're going to merge some of those conversations, and we're going to address this historical place that has been uncovered known as Nigaristan. Now, initially, this discussion of Nigaristan was going to be included in the discussion related to India, West Africa, Mali, Mandi people, and the Moors. But we separated it out so that we can make this a little bit more concise. And so we are going to be looking at some of the discussion related to those eastern migrations from Nigaristan, and also a commenter, a YouTuber, Lex Will. So we're going to look at those two things together because both of these groups or these entities are discussing this dynamic of migration in the East, the Far East, and the Near East, the Middle East, Eastern Africa, and the relationship between that and West Africa, and the relationship between West Africa and the Americas and Europe. And as always, if this video appears on anything other than Dr. Tracey McCarthy, it is stolen and unauthorized. Let's get started. Our starting point is going to be the Nigaristan Forum so that you can see the commentary related to the migration story and creation stories related to West African groups. And so for this particular narrative, we're looking at the migration story, creation story related to the Yoruba, and also it's tied to a discussion related to the Igbo, but they identify that this is a different group of Igbo people. This is a discussion from 2011. And so what you can see here is they are discussing this migration narrative, and they are indicating this belief that the group came from the East and they were persecuted based upon religious differences. And there's also a discussion about fighting and conquering another group of people known as the Igbo, but not the present day Igbo people who are in eastern Nigeria. And part of this discussion in this particular thread involves the relationship between West Africans and a potential Hebrew history. And so if you go to the site, you can actually see, so the information, the reference information is up at the top, so that if you want to go and actually look at the entire thread, you can do that. And so you can see how they are linking things together and where the conversation is going related to this Eastern migration theory. And again, the Eastern migration theory or the narrative has consistently been that they migrated from the East, and the East meaning anywhere from present-day Iraq, Iran, also Egypt. And so there are a few places that are identified in terms of this Eastern migration. Part of this conversation also involves a discussion related to the Igbo people. Now, it's unclear whether or not they are consistently talking about the past Igbo people in this narrative, or they are talking about present-day Igbo individuals. One thing that is noteworthy in this discussion is that there is a discussion related to a person identified as Morimi. And so you can see the root of Moor inside of that particular name. Now we're going to turn our attention to this location known as Nigaristan. And so that people understand what Nigaristan means, it's important to understand the "stan" part at the end. And so what you have is this, what's understood as a Persian or Farsi word meaning country, nation, land, or place of. And so it would be the homeland of whatever comes before it. And so in this case, this would be the homeland or the place of the Nagara. And so you already know from previous conversations that that translates to dark or black. Oddly, in doing a translation, this came up as Japanese detected. However, it translated to little boy. There was another notation on the Warrior Forum related to a similarity between people in Japan and people in Spain and France and the languages of those groups of people. And so there was an identification that the Japanese minority, they actually have a similarity in terms of languages with Spain's Basque people. And they didn't believe that the similarities were based upon a coincidence. And so they give a few examples. And so that might be something that individuals might want to look a little bit more into. In researching information related to India and the Moors, there was a notation related to a place known as Nigaristan. And so, as you can see here in the Slavic collection at Harvard College Library, there is a book that talks about Nigaristan, and this book is from the 1800s. And you can find information related to Nigaristan in the travels in the Transcaucasian provinces of Russia. And it's related to the lakes of Van and Urmia according to this book. However, looking for something that is spelled that way may be a little difficult. There is a lake identified in Iran that is spelled Urmia. Which might be the same location. You also have this Urmia that is also looking similar to the name Uriah. And so there may be a number of avenues that people might want to go down in terms of getting a better understanding of this location. And this book on the Transcaucasian provinces of Russia starts off in chapter 1 with a discussion related to the Palace of Nigaristan, and it's identified as being in Iran. And cross-referencing, you can see that there's also a notation related to Nigaristan in the history of India, and this book came out in 1867. And what's interesting about this is that the book is identified as the history of India as told by its own historians. And you can see here a notation in this particular book where it identifies a place known as Nigaristan. And another notation here, the history of Nigaristan. The history of Nigaristan came out in the 1500s, and you can see clearly here in the abstract that Nigaristan is identified as Iran. And this is really interesting because you have groups of individuals in Nigeria, which would be an equivalent of a Nigaristan, identifying themselves as migrating from the area that is known as Iran. And so in the 1500s, there was apparently a place identified as Nigaristan that would be consistent with this identity coming out of West Africa that involves a migration narrative of coming from the east and specifically coming from Iran, Iraq area. Now, the book is, of course, not written in English, but we are going to look at some depictions that are in the book that create a very interesting narrative related to this place known as Nigaristan. And it ties into the narratives related to other migration stories in the East, also with conquest narratives that were going on in the East. And if anyone can translate this, this is the writing for the book. And these are depictions related to a conquest scene in Nigaristan. One of the things that is interesting to note is that you can see differences related to phenotype, and you can also see differences related to headdress. One thing that's interesting to note also is the feather. And so the feather in the cap usually indicates pride in an accomplishment and achievement. And so you have the feather in the cap. That, however, may not be what this is indicating. However, that is what is known by that idiom. So anyway, you can see the differences in phenotype. And one thing that is noteworthy is there does appear to be a Mongolian phenotype going on with some of the individuals. In the previous scene, you might have also made note of the fact that there was a depiction of a dragon and some sea creatures, so you saw some fish in the water below. Now, in this particular one, this is an interesting related to this conquest scene because this conquest narrative involves the Roman emperor. And so you can see the Roman emperor in this depiction. And interestingly, the Roman emperor in this particular depiction also has a Mongolian phenotype. And if you look closely, you can also see that there are different phenotypes. You might have a what would be stereotypical Mongolian phenotype. However, you might also see that individuals have variations in terms of skin color. And these are additional depictions related to the conquest and Nigaristan. And this is an additional conquest related scene, and you can see here the title is Timur and his army during the campaign in Iraq. Now, interestingly, in this one you also see a variety in terms of phenotype, and you also see differences in terms of headdress. You also do not see readily available on these the feather in the cap. And here you have an actual fight scene, and it's identified as Timur fighting Shah Mansur. And so in this instance, you see individuals with a different headdress. And again, on both sides of the fighting, you see individuals with different phenotypes. And in this depiction, one thing to note is that, again, you see this variety in terms of phenotype. You see variety in terms of headdress. You also see what looks like a monarch in the middle there. And you also see this interesting dynamic off to the left-hand side where you see an individual that is half what appears to be man and half some sort of animal. Needless to say, many people have not ever heard of Nigaristan, but there's another interesting note is that there was actually a ship named Nigaristan, and so there's information related to this ship in the Australian Maritime Museum. And here you can see a depiction of a suite on the ship Nigaristan and also a correspondence, and this is the 1947 type is what this is identified as. And here is another notation related to the Shah and Nigaristan. As we wrap up our very brief discussion related to Nigaristan, hopefully this will give individuals food for thought in terms of merging micro narratives. Sometimes there is a narrative going on in one place and there's a narrative going on in another place, and sometimes those narratives are actually related. And sometimes you have explorations going on in one place that might be aided by explorations going on in another place, and those are going on a micro level as people are trying to understand the macro of human history and existence. One important thing to note is that looking at Nigaristan actually supports the historical narrative that's coming out of West Africa related to their narratives, related to their migration and their origin. This might also help individuals who are in the Americas to understand some of those DNA tests that they might have had done. Now, of course, some people think when they see the DNA test that it's telling them where they are from, but again, it's basically talking about this shared history that you have with the people that are in that area currently. And so one thing that some people might note is that they might have some shared ancestry with individuals from West Africa, but they might also see this shared ancestry with people from the Middle East or the Far East. And so hopefully this helps people to better understand why you might be seeing some of that shared ancestry. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon.